Hello everyone, and today I am delighted to be joined by Harriet Wistrich, who is the founder and director of the Centre for Women's Justice and a solicitor with over 25 years experience working for many years with civil liberties firm Birnberg Peirce and also acting in many high profile cases around violence against women. Harriet has recently published her book Sister in Law, which we will discuss today. Harriet, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. So firstly, before we get into your book and some of your work over the past number of years, I wonder, could you take us back in time a little bit and let us know what inspired you to get into law and in particular to get into the line of work that you've been practicing?
Yes, well, I wasn't actually, I never particularly had an ambition to be a lawyer or thought of it as a path that I would pursue when I was younger, and even after I finished university, I'd been driven from a young age, I think, by passion for feminism and social justice more broadly, and I actually was interested in pursuing perhaps work around the media and communication, and also I was very interested in film, and I sort of got involved in wanting to become a filmmaker. I just kind of felt that would be a really amazing thing to do, and I got involved in some community video groups, and I did some work in the film industry with assistant film editing. And I kind of wanted to make my own films, but it was pretty difficult to break into. And then at the same time that kind of career I was pursuing, I continued with being a feminist activist and ended up getting involved in a campaign around the issue of what we used to describe it as battered women who kill. So basically women in violent domestic violence relationships who ended up killing their violent partners and seemed to be invariably being convicted of murder despite the extreme violence and provocation they were subjected to, whilst in contrast we saw so many cases of men who killed women who were successfully pleading provocation and saying essentially they were, kind of killed because they were insulted in some way, or because she was a nag, or she was going off and having an affair. And they seemed to be getting the sympathy of the courts and the juries, whereas women who were subjected to extreme violence and abuse were being convicted of murder. And it seemed to me, it kind of played out really how fundamentally sexist or misogynist our legal system was, that it was delivering these kind of grotesquely unfair outcomes. And the campaign took off in quite a big way. We formed an organisation called Justice for Women, a campaigning organisation, and started hearing from other women, and got a letter from a young woman called Emma Humphreys, who had been 17 and been in street prostitution and ended up in this horrendously violent relationship, and had and killed her violent partner, who was effectively her pimp also, and was convicted of his murder. And she wrote and said, "Can you help me?" She'd already been in prison by then for 7 years, and through seeing the campaigning and the media stories about some of the other cases we were involved in, together with Southall Black Sisters, around the case of Sarah Thornton and Kiranjit Ahluwalia in particular, were very high-profile campaigns, and said, "Can you help me?" But she wrote in an incredibly powerful way of her experiences, and we weren't lawyers ourselves, but we went to the solicitor who'd represented Kiranjit Ahluwalia, a man called Rohit Sanghvi, and said, "Look, Rohit, would you be able to take on this this case and we'll kind of campaign and support her. And he said, well, I'll take it on, but I haven't got time to do the groundwork and I need somebody to take her account. And by that stage, I was sort of, I kind of got quite drawn into the whole legal issues and I'd been along to a few Court of Appeal cases and got quite fascinated really about the way the law worked. So was vaguely thinking maybe I should consider going into the law. So I volunteered to work with Emma Humphreys, with Rohat as a solicitor, to take her account. And actually, because I had been involved, the kind of filmmaking that I was interested in was around telling people stories. I'd made a film about my grandmother, for example, her experiences during the war. So it was through taking Emma's account and working and then campaigning and working towards her appeal that I then started on the path of training to become a lawyer.
Brilliant, yes. And you mentioned Emma's case and others similar in your book. And firstly, I've read the book. Congratulations on it, by the way. I think it's very readable, both for lawyers and non-lawyers. It's quite startling at times, particularly when we look at the attitude towards women victims of violence from every corner of the system. And it really illustrates individual stories, yes, but it also provides a much wider platform to highlight the Justice for Women campaign that you've mentioned and its aim to eradicate discrimination against women who've endured male violence. What inspired you, Harriet, to write the book at this time?
Well, again, I'd never really particularly thought about writing a book, but in the last few years, through the work I've done, and then through setting up this legal charity called the Centre for Women's Justice, the cases I've been involved in have had quite a high profile, and quite a few people were kind of coming to me and saying, look, why don't you write a book? And I was thinking, well, I just haven't really got time to write a book. Where am I going to fit that in with all the work that I'm doing? But eventually I thought, well, I'll put together a proposal, and the proposal was sent out by an agent and kind of snapped up very quickly. So then I thought, all right, I'll have to find some time to write the book. So that's kind of how it came about.
Very good. And the book, of course, highlights many high-profile cases. Many of us will remember the cases, albeit we might not be necessarily familiar with the legal challenges that presented, which I think you get across really, really well, including the case of Jean-Charles de Menezes, Now, this case was a real prime example of the politics of policing, as you describe in the book, which is really an eye-opener to see all of that interplay. You also go on to highlight misogyny within the police force itself, and the attitudes towards women that you've represented is gut-wrenching, to say the least. Were you at all surprised at the extent to which the criminal justice system appeared to actively work against women? Or during your career, is it something that you became accustomed to witnessing or reading about in reports and statements as time went on?
Well, I think that I'd come to, as I explained, come to practicing law from the perspective of being a feminist who was very aware of everything that was pitted against women, particularly around violence against women. And that included very much the criminal justice system. So I don't think it generally surprised me, but it as I kind of engaged with it more, you kind of began to see exactly how things were pitted against women within the criminal justice system. When I first started practicing as a lawyer, although I had this experience around the Justice for Women campaigns around women who kill, I actually ended up specialising in civil litigation and focusing around issues of of the area of law we call actions against the police. So it was sort of, it was partly just the firm that I trained with, and there was an opportunity there, and I was really kind of became quite fascinated with that and being able to challenge police through legal action. But at the time, this was sort of in the mid-90s when I first started practicing, the kind of area of law that was developing around actions against the police was very much focused on over-policing in terms of unlawful arrest, kind of brutality on controlling protests, and malicious prosecution, and often a real thread of racism within policing. So that tended to be the focus of the work that I was doing. I also did inquest cases where somebody might have died in police custody or in prison or so on. So that was really the focus of my work, and what lawyers weren't really looking at was actually how police were failing to do the jobs they were supposed to do around, preventing or protecting women from male violence and investigating and enabling the prosecution of cases where men were violent towards women, where they should have been policing, if you like. That's where so while we have over policing in some areas, we had in relation to women often under policing, and this seemed an area that really needed some intervention. So that's really how I kind of first started doing work around challenging the police, and also Crown Prosecution Service later and others around their failure to do their job. And if police and the criminal justice system exist for anything, primarily it should be about preventing men from running amok towards women. That should be a kind of key purpose, really, if you like.
Absolutely. And I mean, some of the examples, you give plenty throughout your book, but in some instances you see where a woman has to report sexual violence or a rape, something horrific that's happened to her. And, she'd be directed to, remain calm, speak in a factual way, don't get too emotional. And then when she delivers her statement based on those directions, later on you'll find that the police would say, well, nobody's going to believe you because you didn't cry. So it's instances like that you highlight that really make you think, wow, how difficult was it for women to report, and how brave they were to do so, and why we maybe see underreporting as a real issue even now. And on that, I suppose you mentioned the abysmal failures of the criminal justice system in the UK as a whole, and also just the incompetencies that we see throughout policing. But over the past decades, with your work on cases impacting women, violence against women, do you think the system has improved in terms of women who are seeking justice? I know with some of your cases, like Sally Challen, it brought up the concept of coercive control, which is something that we're seeing used more often now. But on the whole, have things improved?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think in many ways things have moved on a lot from, say the early 90s or the 80s. There is a much greater awareness and around child sexual abuse, rape, DV, and also the issue, honour-based violence, female genital mutilation, etc., all the different forms of violence towards women, and there are more laws aimed at tackling it. There are policies in place, and training and guidance about how to tackle it across the criminal justice system. In some ways, that obviously that is good, but in practice, there's really a kind of I've got the word, but disjuncture or whatever between what exists theoretically and what happens in practice. And so even with all the laws and policies, etc., we're just seeing a really woeful failure to implement them. So that is part of the reason why I decided to set up the Centre for Women's Justice, to really have a legal charity and organisation dedicated to challenging through legal mechanisms the state, the criminal justice system in particular, around its failures in respect of violence against women, and to use the law as a tool to hold those agencies accountable.
Yeah.
I think the other bit of the story around how things improve for women is that whilst I think many more women will come forward to report violence towards them, and so in a way that's really, really positive. I think we also have to recognise how the nature of male violence towards women has changed over time.
Sure.
So obviously we have this much more stuff happening on the internet, which is harder often to police, and we have this kind of underlying misogynistic culture derived a lot, I think, from hardcore pornography, which is so readily available and particularly amongst young people, is consumed by young people with really horrendous attitudes towards women, and then young women feeling, in particular, according to surveys and research, as though they need to now not just consent to sex when they're not sure about it, but consent to really degrading practices like being and dangerous practices like being strangled or anally penetrated, and other forms of practice which women wouldn't necessarily enjoy, but they feel and which I think come from a narrative that belongs in pornography, but feel like if they don't agree to it, there's something wrong with them, or they take that kind of narrative with them, that, or they're in the old days you'd be prudish if you didn't have sex, and now you're prudish if you're not consenting to being strangled or anally penetrated.
It's very worrying. And just before we come on, I'd mentioned to you, I mean, Northern Ireland, we're really lagging here. It's really a crisis stage, I feel. We had, unfortunately, another woman murdered yesterday. And, I mean, the figures are startling. Between 2017 and 2022, I think there were 34 women in this small part of the world killed by men. So we really have a mountain of work to do here, and some movement has been made in terms of lobbying for a strategy for violence against women and girls, but really we're really lagging behind. I feel it's a crisis. Just in terms of your clients that we see in the book, and other clients that you've reached out to and represented across the years, they come to you to seek justice very often against state agents and perpetrators in cases where justice just seems so far out of reach. In your book, you note that invariably your clients will tell you, I'm doing this because I don't want anyone else to go through what I've been through. So it is a significant undertaking in part of, yourself, your legal team, to represent people who've been through hell and back, and who often feel very vulnerable and exposed after their report. So I'm just wondering, how does it feel on both a professional and a personal level to act in litigation that is, as you mentioned, so painfully slow and sometimes brutal for the client?
I suppose it feels as though you can sometimes make a real difference, and you do get very drawn into those stories. It's sometimes quite difficult to kind of maintain a separation and not kind of feel, in order to I suppose effectively represent somebody, you kind of need to go on a bit of a journey with them and try and understand and feel the pain that they're experiencing. So it can be quite emotional, but clearly you need to take care of yourself, or you're not going to be an effective advocate.
Sure.
So there is a degree of separation, I guess. But it's also, I think, it's just a challenge, really, to, you know, I feel sometimes so angry on behalf of women that I assist, and I kind of want to assist them, really, in standing up to, you know, bullies, and standing up to, you know, these, you know, monstrous institutions that are well paid and preening in public, and then are kind of abjectly failing these women. So it's kind of like you get drawn into the challenge a bit, I think.
Yeah, and you really get drawn into the individual stories that you highlight in your book. Some of them are so tragic, and even after they, you know, are successful in their litigation, and perhaps they're able to walk free from court that day, which really brought tears to my eyes in some of the cases, where you can really feel that sense of justice and relief for the entire legal team, but also the woman at the centre of the case. And then, you know, it's so difficult for a lot of people who've been through that horrendous system to adapt to life after that. And although you know, we celebrate the success, you see how damage has been done to women who've been through the criminal justice system and really had a brutal experience on top of what they had already suffered. But I suppose with your cases and your many successes, and, you know, the fantastic campaign work that you and your colleagues have been doing, can you name a career highlight to date, something that really stands out for you in terms of your work?
I think there've been a lot of really big highlights for me, and many of them I've described in the book. I mean, I think in the early days, the Emma Humphreys case was such an important case, and it kind of really set me on a path. More recently, the Sally Challen case was such a huge challenge. That case, it really was a pretty impossible case to appeal, and it took me many years to figure out a way of getting there. And then, you know, we had such, you know, it's had such a huge impact. So I'm pretty proud of what we achieved in that case. Also very proud of the case we brought against the police in the John Worboys case, the multiple serial rapist taxi driver in London who raped, you know, well over 100 women. And we not only was that an important victory in holding the police accountable, but it really established in law a very important precedent, which we now use a lot of the time, which is a way in which you can hold the police accountable for failures to investigate. You know, it has to be on a fairly systemic level, but it's a really important precedent under Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. So I guess that is, you know, I'm very proud of having contributed to setting that precedent. And then finally, sorry to do a few. I think in terms of you know, kind of an absolutely fascinating case that I was drawn into, and, you know, is still an ongoing issue, but being part of helping to get justice for women who were deceived into long-term intimate sexual relationships with undercover police officers. That was a very powerful case to work around.
It was, and I was really shocked reading about those individual cases. I mean, you do hear of that happening, but it was so prevalent, and the real infiltration into a woman's private life was really just startling to see. So, and I know that those cases in itself presented such challenges, and they were very novel. You know, I could see there were different strands that you could approach. So you and your legal team and the barristers who were involved, you know, had to come up with different scenarios that would provide some sort of effective remedy for each of the women, but then as a collective as well. So that was really powerful to read how that turned out. And I guess, Harriet, finally, how important is law and activism in your opinion, in terms of achieving social change and societal change, how impactful is that? And also, I suppose, as a second part to that question, do you think the Me Too movement provided or provides a meaningful platform for women?
So two separate questions, aren't there?
Really, I suppose they are.
How important? So I think what I when I wrote the book, I enjoyed writing it a lot, actually, because it was a really good chance to kind of reflect on my career as a lawyer and how I've gone about achieving justice for women, and one of the things which I think will come through from the book is about the importance of collaborative work. So, lawyers don't achieve, obviously some cases, a lawyer can create a really important precedent by being a clever lawyer, but mainly the changes that are achieved one through working collaboratively and closely with your client, but also where appropriate, working with supporters and campaigners, working with the media, and working with a team within your legal team, to just and it's that kind of collaborative approach, I think, that can help achieve kind of impactful outcomes. So that's one thing I'd say I've learned, and I think it's really critical that laws, legal action can make change, but if you look at something like the case of Sally Challen, it was also the huge campaigning around that case that did far more than simply achieve justice for Sally. It kind of raised awareness around the phenomenon of coercive controlling behaviour, and so I think that was an example really of how a legal case can have a much wider impact.
Sure.
And even sometimes when you lose a case, you can still have an impact by the way in which the narrative of that case. Me Too, I think it certainly was a very important moment. I think there have been many Me Toos over the years, and I think it was very significant at the time, but as with any kind of awareness raising, there are these backlashes, and then the moment kind of goes, and then you wait a few years, and then there's another moment, so in relation to that, it's sort of, it was big at the time, and it was big in certain circles, and it was really important that kind of some high profile Hollywood actors spoke out at that time. But then we already see the backlash, and suddenly the court has even overturned one of the convictions of Harvey Weinstein recently.
That's right. Yeah.
Concerning grounds, from what I can see. I haven't really looked at it closely. So, these things, we have these moments, but we have to keep, they keep coming up again and again, I'd say. So, yes, it's really important that they happen, and they will continue to happen, I believe, because, we're in a constant battle, really.
Well, Harriet, I'd like to thank you for sharing your work with us and sharing your time with us. And it's been fascinating reading your book and getting to know a lot more about your work and the women that you've helped over the decades. So congratulations on your book, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.